I'm Brian Glick. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Computer Weekly. And in this video, we're going to be talking about an increasingly important role for many organisations across Europe, and that's the job of the Chief Information Security Officer. You'll often see it abbreviated to CISO if it's written down, and you'll hear us referring to it as the CISO. This is a job that is responsible for all things cybersecurity in an organisation. So what we want to do here is to try and get an understanding of why this job is so important and what the challenges are that are facing CISOs across Europe today. Now, to help me do that, I'm joined by somebody with a huge amount of experience in this field. That's Liz Morton. Liz is the field CISO at Axonius. Liz, welcome. Thanks for coming along to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you're an experienced cybersecurity leader. For the purposes of the audience, what is a CISO?
The CISO is really the senior leader, the most senior leader responsible for securing, generally speaking, the data, the sometimes physical security requirements for a company, for enacting the cybersecurity program to be responsive to regulatory requirements, sometimes from a compliance perspective as well. And generally, the CISO can sit anywhere in an organization. Sometimes they report into the chief information officer. Sometimes they report to the CEO of a company. Sometimes they don't have the title CISO, but they're still doing the work. So you'll see things like VP Cybersecurity or Director of Information Security, titles like that.
So you've introduced us there a little bit into who the CISO is and what the CISO does. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do as well, Liz, and the organisation that you work for?
Sure. So I have the title of Field CISO. So a slight variation on the idea of CISO. What I do is basically serve as an advisor, primarily for Axonius. What I do is I have the privilege of working with some of our customers. Some of them are large, some of them are small, but all of them have questions about how to achieve a greater level of efficacy with their security programs. And since my background is in both operations and cyber, I have a pretty strong opinion of how some of them can improve their security programs, especially using Axonius as sort of the foundation for their program. Axonius is actually a great tool. Before I worked for Axonius as the field CISO, I ran cybersecurity for a company called Intercontinental Exchange. They're best known for owning the New York Stock Exchange. Here in the UK, they run ICE Futures Europe and ICE Clear Europe. And I had the pleasure of working for them for a very long time, learned a lot. Really, really great company. And it gave me a strong foundation for working with customers across a lot of different sectors, just from my career, my experience at ICE. And then just what's wonderful about working with our customers is that I learned from them too. So the reason Axonius is kind of well-positioned as a software company in the cybersecurity space these days is that it addresses a lot of the things that are plaguing, so to speak, CISOs in terms of how to get it done. In a lot of organizations, cybersecurity does not have either access or ownership of things like the CMDB or the systems of record. So what Axonius wants to be is the digital system of record for every piece of infrastructure, identity, anything that you would call an asset in your organization. And what we can do once we've achieved that level of data collection, what we do is we can provide things like deduplication, correlation, and really deep insight into each of your assets and how they relate to one another. So then you're talking about context. This is kind of the holy grail of both operations and cybersecurity, because visibility is key to being able to do anything in your environment. If you know what your assets look like across all plants, and by all plants, I mean end user compute systems, so all of your laptops that are out there in the world, whether you're running a BYOD program, frankly, or whether you're providing your end users with those assets, your on-premise data centers, your public clouds, anywhere you have an asset, your identities, and so on and so forth. If you have full visibility and you know with assurance, right, that there is quality to that data, you can do just about anything. So one of the things I like the most about Axonius is that it is a wonderful data layer for automation. And automation, I think, is the only way that we as an industry are going to be able to respond to the needs of our businesses at scale with speed and efficacy. And the quality of your outcomes when it comes to automation has everything to do with the quality of your data. So it is totally my pleasure to work on a consultative basis with our customers and show them kind of the beauty of what you can do once you have that kind of visibility into your environments.
It's an interesting way you've defined it there. Is it tells us in many ways that in some respects it's an ill-defined role in terms of both where it sits in the
Yes.
in the organisation structure and what the scope of the job is. In recent years, we've had things like GDPR, NIS2, we've got DORA, we've got the EU digital wallet. How do you see CISOs in Europe operating, and what are the specific things they need to do to tackle that unique environment?
Well, I think there's similarities across the board because we're talking about how to secure any entity, right? Are you a government? Are you a private industry? Are you running an educational institution, for instance? There are some commonalities of just good practice, right? These frameworks that you mentioned, they exist for a reason, and that is so that we have a common way of understanding what is secure. How do we get there? And very often it has a lot less to do with sort of fancy, exciting sounding tools and a lot more to do with following best practices. So I would say the first challenge most CISOs have within the EU especially, I would think, is following the guidelines that are handed down by the various entities that are responsible for these frameworks and their definition. Following those guidelines from an execution perspective, because that introduces a very common business problem, which is taking a set of requirements and translating them into a business need, and then translating that need into a way to fund the execution thereof, right? So sometimes that means the CISO's biggest challenge is making sure that the rest of the C-suite understands what the risks are, how implementing a new item of security training, for instance, how is that going to impact our bottom line from a cost perspective, but also how is that going to improve and enhance our business?
You've explained very well there some of the unique characteristics and the unique challenges for CISOs in Europe, but obviously, they're part of a globalized world.
Yeah.
There are challenges that affect CISOs all around the world, US, Europe, and elsewhere. Tell us a little bit about some of those. What are the biggest global challenges that CISOs generally are having to face, whether they're in Europe or not at the moment?
Right. Yeah. Well, we're all kind of dealing with the same neighborhood when we talk about especially the interconnected world. And it kind of doesn't matter where you physically sit as a person or as a CISO. You are dealing with the world and all of its offerings, good and bad. So going back to what I said before, translating sort of security requirements. You have a vulnerability management program. What are you doing with that? How are you measuring that? Are you successful in handling your vulnerabilities? What does that look like to your business? If you're in the EU or in parts of APAC, you're going to have some regulatory oversight that is going to give you an idea of what your conditions of success look like, potentially. But in the end, it all comes down to what are your resources? Are you able to execute? Are you able to show that your program is effective? We all want our environments to be secure because we're seeing with increased frequency what happens when you're not secure, or what can happen, I should say.
Let me explore, if I may, I think the thread that's coming out through a couple of your last answers there. Obviously, security, managing risk is an essential for any business, but it's not the reason any business exists.
Right.
You've talked about the need for being able to translate security into what the business needs. Now, every CISO is going to be getting pressure from their chief executive, from the board. We want more innovation. We want more speed. We need our organisation generally to be able to move faster and react to what's happening in our business environment. Yet at the same time, you've got this CISO who's having to say, well, we've got this regulation, we've got that regulation, we've got this framework we've got to do, we've got these, nation state actors, these bad actors that we've got to consider as well. Now, that's a really difficult balance to get right. How do you go about, getting that balance right, maintaining what you have to do as a CISO when your number one task really is just to make your business grow and be more successful?
Right. That's the business side of being a CISO, right? Which there's a lot of talk about the role of a CISO and how it's evolved. I think you alluded earlier to it's a role that lacks definition. Well, that's fairly true. I think that stepping away from the role of the CISO in particular and going over to the discussion of like the security and innovation, security and commercial success, that is pushing CISOs really to be business minded. And I think as we have evolved as an industry, as a cybersecurity industry, we're starting to talk more about business. We're using the language of business more. The convergence between the function of a CISO and the function of a CIO, like those are kind of coming together. Sometimes you'll see a CISO reporting to a CIO. Sometimes they'll be peers, for instance. That to me is a signal of an organization's dedication to having someone in charge of security because from a commercial and innovation perspective, it's important. I think there's lots that's been said about the benefits of involving security early on in any kind of large-scale project, for instance.
Let me add one more complication to the mix, if I may, for you, and that's something that is particularly acute in the UK. It's the same, I think, across Europe, and I'm sure it's probably an issue around the globe as well. The skills to do this job are in very, very short supply. A lot of CISOs and indeed CIOs and IT leaders that I talk to across Europe say, our biggest problem is we desperately need more cybersecurity skills. How do you go about just making sure that you've got enough team, a big enough team with the right skills, and how do you make sure that their skills are able to keep up to date with this incredibly fast-moving technical business and regulatory environment that you've been describing?
Yeah. Okay. So let's dive in. There's a lot there. So from a skills perspective, I think just to start there, it's kind of the age-old question, buy or build. There are all kinds of programs across the globe that are designed to bring people who come from backgrounds not cybersecurity into cybersecurity. Why? Because while this is a technical field, it's not exclusively a technical field. Let's not forget that we have a lot of need for soft skills in this space. And not to say that this is soft skills, but just GRC alone as a function, just assurance alone as a function, which is basically, that's your second line of defense. So first, I think there is the identification of the kind of person, the kind of brain, the kind of background that would be good at X, Y, or Z. I think when we think about cybersecurity professionals, we think about red teamers, we think about blue teamers, we think about people that have a very specific set of skills, because you have to identify people who have technical acumen and the desire to learn how to kind of break things and set traps and solve problems in these very interesting ways. And those folks are absolutely essential to the defense of an organization. But if you kind of back up a little and you look at what actually is required to have a quality cybersecurity program in place, very often you're not talking about your incident responders. You're talking about your engineers. Now, an IT engineer can have training in cybersecurity as well, or they can be like I was when I started. My background was in operations. I didn't do cyber work before I walked into a cybersecurity department, but I had a strong foundation in architecture and engineering because that was my field for years and years and years. They translate. Those skills can translate. So I think I know in the UK and the EU, there is definitely a lot of discussion around formalization of requirements and skills. This is something that I think is a different sort of way of thinking about building a team from a sort of European versus American perspective. The American perspective is kind of like I've just described. We need some engineers. Can't find any cyber engineers, but got these other engineers over here in IT. Maybe we should give them a try. I think that's actually an incredibly positive thing when you think about what we're doing as a industry, which is, I think, slowly converging into the world of traditional IT and operations. And we're building more professionals that way. Now, how does a CISO go about building a team when you know that you have a shortage of, say, defenders, or a shortage of, and when I say defender, I mean an incident responder, or a shortage of red team skills, or what have you? Well, you've got a couple of options. One is to obviously do something like a staff aug. A lot of companies will have managed service providers that provide them with a 24/7 SOC, for instance, because they don't have the resources for it. So some of it is like you have to buy those skills until you can build them in-house, or maybe you just always buy those skills. But I do think that the other option is to look at what you have in terms of capabilities already. Good cyber hygiene, for instance, looking at your resilience plans, looking at how well your sort of operational framework kind of overlays with how you're running your cyber program from an execution perspective. In other words, maybe you can get a little bit of help, let's say, from your operations groups if you are in a lesser resourced company by just adhering to sort of the technical how-tos of your company. You should also really consider automation. It takes a long time to grow an automation program that can fully supplement the need for a human. The nice thing is once you get there, you're there, right? So I would say if I had one piece of advice for CISOs, if you want to optimize your sort of investment in your resource pool at large, think about not making your people work harder than your machines.
Let's take a slightly different perspective on it and look to the future a little bit.
Okay.
What excites you about the future of the role of the CISO, and how do you see that role evolving to meet all the challenges that you've talked about?
Yeah, I actually really like the way the industry is going. I think for a long time, cybersecurity folk have been maybe outside the view or outside the understanding or outside of the scope of traditional business or traditional even IT and operations. Cyber folks were just kind of different. And I think in a lot of cases, the CISO was, I think, as you mentioned at the beginning, the guy who was in charge of making sure you had antivirus installed, which is like a vast oversimplification of everything that was likely happening in those departments, but that's all they really got credit for. I think that's totally changed. There have been so many incidents over the last decade, for instance, and that's just taking a time slice. We could go back further, where it's been proven that had better security measures been in place, the company would have been better off commercially. It only takes one incident, really, to really open your eyes, if you think about it, to the costs. And there's all kinds of data about the cost of cyber incidents and what have you. And I think that's doing is that's forcing cybersecurity into the forefront of not just what C-suite executives are thinking about, but what boards are thinking about how we measure profitability in some cases, how we measure risk. This is making the CISO a necessarily more business-minded individual, which is, I think, a great relief, because trying to not be at the table with the rest of the business leaders while also kind of working in service to them, that only takes you so far. You have to be at the table as an equal. In other words, it's less expensive to mount a good hygiene campaign than it is to mount a defense. And that, I mean, it comes out in the numbers in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing, your perspectives, Liz, on the challenges and difficulties facing CISOs. But I think that's a great way to wrap up as well with some of the exciting challenges and the great opportunities that are emerging for CISOs across Europe. Liz Morton from Axonius, thank you for taking the time to come along and talk to us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
That's all we've got time for on this video. I hope you've been able to take away some useful insights into the role of the CISO and the challenges that they face, particularly within European organisations today. Now, this was the first of a three-part series of videos examining the role of the CISO. There's also a couple others talking to some real-life CISOs as well about some of the challenges that they're facing within their specific jobs and the organisations that they work for. So have a look out for those too as well. Thanks very much for watching. Bye-bye.